Hello, in part two of this video, which is the general introduction into property, the nature of property, and some uh, foundational issues looking at what is property. Is property the physical thing, or is it, as Cohen basically goes on to say, it's a social relation, which is basically whether to include or exclude the rest of the world of your physical thing, which is endorsed and supported by the state. So now I want to take this one step further by looking at Blomley's 2003 article on law, property, and the geography of violence, the frontier, the survey, and the grid. Now, Blomley is a geographer, so when we talk about his arguments, he's not like Cohen concerned with definitions and laying out these relationships. His is quite a geographical piece, so you'll see it's different. But the reason why it's important to talk about Blomley, in my opinion, is because he is talking about he's showing that the practical implications of property and property law can extend so far. In fact, I'm reading a book at the moment on economics, and it turns out that even in rural India, where there's lots of poor people, that even if you just write at the door of the house, the shack where the family lives, the wife's name, not just Mr. X's house, you're at Mr. and Mrs. X's house, that women with having that name just on the door, even though they might not have property rights, they are more likely to take contraceptive because they feel more like they have more independence, more value, and it just shows that. And contraception is linked to economic growth and things like that. So that's what I was reading about, and it's just important to see that property can be so important, because having the wife's name written on the door, you're basically giving her some kind of authority to say, okay, I'm going to exclude these people from coming into my property and include these people, whether or not, in terms of the will property, she's included, but just having that one little thing can make a big difference. And so property law is so fundamental, and that's probably why I love it so much. And so I want to talk a bit about Blomley's article. So what his whole 22-page article is saying is that property is intertwined with violence. The two can't really be separated. And thus, he comes to the premise that there is a geography of a violence, right? Violence is not something that just happens, or is this. There is a geography to it. There's a pattern, there's an understanding, there's a trend. So this is what he comes up with. Now, if we just look at that argument for a minute before we go on to his points about the frontier, the survey, the grid, when I say violence, what does that mean? Well, I think he talks a lot from the whole point of violence in the past in terms of colonization and colonial powers and things like that. But if we're going to apply it today, we have to also talk about the threat of violence, forcing people to leave their houses and, things like that. And, when if you can't pay your mortgage repayments in America, and the way people just, their houses get repossessed and they get chucked out and they don't really have much notice of it, things like that. That's what I think constitute when we say violence is so intertwined with property. And then to come to the conclusion that because these two cannot be separated, and as the geography he basically seems to say is exactly the same as property, there is a geography of violence. I'm not sure this is correct, because if we looked at Cohen, we're talking about property being all about defining social relationships. So to say that because these social relationships are intertwined with violence, that we can start putting a geographical map to it, I'm a bit skeptical, but let's see. So what does he mean by when he talks about the frontier? He's talking about a moving border or area in which there are some fighting, there are some tensions between who owns the land. And so previously this was to do with colonial powers, because they came in, they looked at the natives, and they didn't understand what their natives were using the land for, and it just, they thought there was subhuman, things like that. So they came, there was violence there, and that's how colonial powers took the land. And so, where property rights started to be established, that this is the rights of the colonial powers, there you had violence. But again, as I was saying, with the meaning of the word violence, we don't just mean like physical harm. We mean sometimes the threat of violence and the kind of mental violence that also goes on. So how could we apply this in today's day and age? Could be that we're talking about things like gentrification, and also if you look at, like, for example, in the Olympics, so many people were relocated from the East End and told to move. And so you move these poor people, these council houses, further, further, further. You have the moving border. So that's what he probably means by the frontier. And the fact that this is also, so you have this violence which is, intertwined with property, because you're changing the land use, the land ownership. And so that's how he, comes to the conclusion that there is a geography of violence, and the violence is moving further, further away because, you're gentrifying and developing the land. Again, I think property is social, to do with social relation, your right to exclude or include somebody in your property. So I'm not sure I completely agree that property is the same as saying land use and ownership. I think it's different, and I think it's more subtle than that. Then he talks about the survey, and he says a survey is a way of measuring and dividing the land between people. It's often inaccurate because you try to make the science out of something which is, if it's to do with relationships and intangible things, measuring and dividing and trying to make it scientific, it doesn't always work. There you have violence, and therefore, you can have a geography of a violence. And this, he furthers on this point. He enhances it by talking about the grid, and he goes, basically what the grid does, it creates zones where it's basically acceptable, violence is accepted. So in your private property, it's acceptable to have a fight or have domestic violence like that. You're creating zones in which violence is acceptable, and you do that how? But you do that through property, and therefore there is a geography of violence. Now, why I think Blomley's article is important to the law side, the legal side of property law, is because I think it's just showing, like, that we might think property law, oh, it's just confined. It's how do I explain it? It's just like when you look at criminal law, it's just a crime and you deal with it, and that's the end of story. But it's clearly not, because property law can extend to talking about the environment and just about everything else. And it started to rain. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will post more soon. Thank you.